The stench of stagnant air lingered in the trenches of World War I, where the soldiers stood like statues, covered in mud, staring across no man's land. For years, they had watched the futile back and forth, the endless barrage of artillery and gunfire, with no end in sight. The trenches were a prison, a cold, narrow stretch of land where men lived in constant fear of death, whether by shell, bullet, or the suffocating weight of their own despair. This was a war of attrition, and every day felt like the last. Bodies piled in the mud, forgotten until the next wave came through. The ground itself had become a graveyard, a grim testament to the inability of either side to break the stalemate. Soldiers, once filled with youthful hope, now barely remembered what it was like to see daylight, to experience life outside of their claustrophobic earthworks. The rhythm of war was endless, relentless, a repetitive cycle of offense and defense that led nowhere. The landscape was scarred, not just by shells, but by time itself. The promise of victory seemed more distant with each passing day, yet, amidst the agony of trench warfare, something began to stir, an idea. It was born out of desperation, a need to change the game that had paralyzed them for so long. The very notion of a machine that could move across the battlefield, impervious to bullets, became the spark of an idea that would eventually disrupt the rules of war forever. The air buzzed with the first whispers of innovation. In the dampness of the trenches, soldiers, exhausted from the unrelenting violence, began to dream of something that could end their suffering, an armored behemoth that could bulldoze its way through the battlefield, crushing obstacles and bullets alike. Early experiments were clumsy, rudimentary, armored cars and strange land ships designed to break through barbed wire and enemy lines. But these ideas were still tethered to the past, built on the same principles of traditional warfare, simply trying to find a way to survive. It wasn't until engineers, visionaries in their own right, took the initiative to push beyond those boundaries that the true potential of these machines began to emerge. They understood that war wasn't about playing by the same rules anymore. It was about rewriting them altogether. The first tanks were clumsy and slow, their armor heavy and their engines struggling, but they had something that no soldier in the trenches had, a chance to break free from the monotonous dance of death that had defined the war up to that point. The land ships were the first steps toward a future of mechanized warfare, and as they rumbled to life, their designers dared to dream that these machines could carry the future of the battlefield on their tracks. But as the idea of tanks began to take shape, so too did the resistance. The British military, entrenched in tradition and skeptical of anything that seemed too untested or revolutionary, mocked the idea of a machine that could conquer the battlefield. How could something so new, so different, possibly work in the chaos of war? Military leaders, many of them steeped in the methods of old, laughed at the thought of a machine breaking through the strongholds of the enemy. It seemed absurd, like something out of a science fiction novel. They were soldiers, not inventors, and the practicalities of war had taught them to trust what they knew, what had worked for centuries. A tank, as the critics saw it, was a folly, a mere fantasy that would never stand up to the brutality of combat. The very idea of a mechanized army seemed laughable in the face of the soldiers who had lived through the horrors of the front lines. And yet, as these mockeries rang out, a quiet belief began to form within the ranks of those determined to prove the doubters wrong. For every skeptic, there were those who saw the potential, who saw what the future could hold. What was once a laughingstock would soon become the harbinger of a new era in warfare. Behind the creation of the Mark I tank stood a group of individuals whose names, though often forgotten by the public, were pivotal in shaping the future of warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton, a man with a vision far ahead of his time, was among the first to imagine the potential of a new type of weapon that could smash through the stalemate of trench warfare. Swinton was not a traditional soldier. His mind was that of a strategist, a thinker who believed that war, as it was known, needed to evolve. In 1914, as he sat in his office, observing the bloodshed and horror of the war, he began to conceive of a solution that seemed almost fantastical: a moving fortress, a machine capable of traversing the muddy battlefield, impervious to bullets and able to clear enemy defenses. His vision was bold, but it was the spark needed to ignite an entirely new approach to combat. Alongside him was Walter Wilson, an engineer whose technical prowess would breathe life into the idea. Wilson, along with a team of designers and engineers, began to sketch and build prototypes, working tirelessly, often in secrecy, to craft something that would defy the very laws of military tradition. Together, these men weren't just dreaming. They were daring to believe that, with enough ingenuity, they could create a machine that could change the course of history. Their work was a testament to the power of human vision, hope, and the willingness to challenge the limits of possibility. The road to realizing the Mark I was not without its obstacles. The early attempts to build the tank were plagued with technical failures that could have crushed the ambitions of lesser minds. First, there were the tracks, a critical component that would allow the vehicle to cross difficult terrain. Early designs for the tracks were clumsy, and the tanks would frequently get stuck in the mud, rendering them useless on the battlefield. Engineers had to rethink the very concept of mobility, reimagining the tank as a vehicle capable of overcoming the impossible. Then there was the issue of armor. The tank had to be strong enough to withstand gunfire and shrapnel, yet light enough to move efficiently. The balance between these two factors was incredibly difficult to achieve. The team also struggled with the engine. The technology of the time was not designed for such a massive machine, and early engines overheated, sputtered, or broke down altogether. Every step forward seemed to be followed by 2 steps back, yet the vision remained unshaken. There were moments of frustration, designs that failed, tests that didn't work, but with each setback, the engineers learned, adjusted, and pushed on. It was a struggle, but it was also a testament to the perseverance of those involved. The challenges were immense, yet they refused to give up. Each problem solved, no matter how small, felt like a victory in itself. The vision was becoming a reality, but not without tremendous effort and sacrifice. The technical struggle wasn't just about creating a machine. It was about inventing something entirely new, something that had never existed before. Then, finally, the moment arrived. The first prototype of the Mark I tank was ready for testing. The sense of anticipation was palpable as the engineers and designers gathered around the vehicle that had consumed so much of their time and energy. The tank was massive, its hulking frame dwarfing the men around it. It was a far cry from the sleek machines of today, but in its raw power, there was something awe-inspiring. As the engine roared to life, a wave of excitement surged through the team. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the culmination of countless hours of labor, failure, and triumph. The first tests were nerve-wracking. Would it move? Would the tracks hold? Could it truly navigate the muddy battlefield? The team watched in silent anticipation as the Mark I lurched forward, its massive treads grinding into the earth. It was slow, clumsy, and cumbersome, but it moved, and that, in itself, was an achievement. The first successful test was a triumph, a moment that proved that, against all odds, the impossible had been made possible. The tank wasn't perfect, but it was a start. There was still much to refine, but the spark of possibility had been ignited. The Mark I tank was no longer just a dream. It was a reality, and its future would change the course of the war. The excitement in the air was palpable, and for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of hope on the horizon. The impossible had been achieved. The first test of the Mark I tank was nothing short of a pivotal moment in the history of warfare. It was early morning when the beast, as some had come to call it, rumbled to life for the very first time. The engineers and designers who had poured their hearts and souls into the project stood in silent anticipation, watching as their creation took its first hesitant steps. The tank's engine growled to life, its tracks grinding against the uneven earth. There was an almost surreal quality to the moment, as if the very ground beneath the tank knew that it was about to witness something that would change the face of war forever. The first few meters were unsteady, the movement stiff and uncertain. But with every lurch forward, the team could feel their hearts swell with hope. The tank moved, slow and heavy, but it moved. It crossed trenches and surmounted obstacles that had once been impassable, proving that the design could work. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was a beginning. There was a sense of relief that washed over the engineers, a collective breath held for so long that was finally exhaled. The Mark I wasn't just an idea anymore, it was real, and it had the potential to do exactly what its creators had envisioned. This moment of success, though small, proved the impossible could be achieved. The tank had been brought to life, and the dream of turning it into a viable weapon had begun. However, this breakthrough did not come without its share of challenges. The first trials were far from flawless. Despite the exhilaration of seeing the tank in action, it became painfully clear that there were many technical issues that still needed to be addressed. The tracks, which had been a central innovation in the design, were prone to failure, often slipping off or becoming stuck in the mud. The engine, while strong enough to get the tank moving, frequently overheated, making long-distance travel impossible. The armor, although effective against small arms fire, was heavy, and the tank struggled to maintain speed and agility. There were moments of doubt when the machine seemed more burden than blessing, as engineers scrambled to make adjustments on the fly. The first tanks, though revolutionary in their design, were still raw and unrefined. There were failures, many failures, but each one brought a new lesson. The team persevered, determined to overcome every obstacle that stood in their way. The growing pains were tough, but they were not insurmountable. Engineers worked tirelessly, adjusting, reworking, and refining every aspect of the tank's design. The first tests had proven that the tank could move, but now the real challenge was proving that it could function effectively in battle. It was a hard, exhausting process, but with each failure, the tank grew stronger, more capable. The idea that had once seemed so far-fetched was now on the verge of becoming reality. By the time the tank was ready for military deployment, it had undergone a complete transformation. What had once been a bulky, clumsy prototype was now a fully functioning weapon of war. The tank had been tested, refined, and tested again. Each technical issue had been addressed, from the engine to the tracks, the armor to the weapons. It was a testament to the relentless determination of those who had worked on it. As the Mark I rolled onto the battlefield for its first real test in combat, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Soldiers watched in awe as the massive machine rumbled across the front lines, its enormous presence a stark contrast to the fragile, human soldiers that followed. For the first time, it seemed like the balance of power could shift. The tank tore through enemy lines with a force that had never been seen before. Its armor absorbed the enemy's bullets, and its treads crushed everything in its path. The soldiers on both sides were stunned, unsure of what they were witnessing. This was no longer a fantastical idea, it was a weapon of war. As the tank rolled through the battlefield, breaking down the traditional barriers of combat, there was a collective realization: the future had arrived. The military, once skeptical of the tank's potential, now saw its power. This wasn't just an experimental machine, it was the future of warfare. The Mark I had proven itself not only as a functional weapon, but as the harbinger of a new era in combat. The tide had turned, and with it, the belief in the tank's effectiveness was no longer in question. The validation of the tank's design was complete, and the optimism surrounding its future use began to swell. The war would never be the same again. As dawn broke over the battlefield of the Somme, a sense of heavy anticipation hung in the air. The sounds of artillery fire and the distant crackle of machine guns had been a constant for months, but this morning felt different. The soldiers knew that today, something new, something potentially game-changing, was about to be unleashed. The Mark I tanks, their hulking metal frames cloaked in mystery and uncertainty, had finally arrived at the front lines. They were a symbol of innovation, of the desperate hope for change in the grim, stagnant cycle of trench warfare. For the men who had fought and bled in the trenches, the idea of a weapon that could move across the battlefield impervious to bullets was nothing short of revolutionary. But for the officers and commanders who had never seen the tanks in action, there was doubt. The question remained, would these machines live up to the hype, or would they fail, just like so many other untested ideas before them? As the first tanks rolled into position, their massive tracks grinding against the earth, the air seemed to hold its breath. The weight of history was on the tanks' shoulders, and every man, on both sides, was waiting to see if they would live up to their promise. The tension was palpable, and as the tanks prepared to advance, the landscape itself seemed to shudder in anticipation. When the tanks finally began their advance, the effect was nothing short of breathtaking. They were unlike anything the enemy had ever seen. The Germans, entrenched in their positions, watched in disbelief as the massive metal machines lumbered toward them, their enormous tracks crushing the earth beneath them. The shock on their faces was clear, their previous confidence now shattered by the sight of these unstoppable behemoths. For months, the soldiers on both sides had been entrenched in an unyielding deadlock, the battle lines barely moving, but now, in front of them, were tanks, mechanized monsters that could bulldoze their way through barbed wire, trenches, and machine gun nests with ease. The first few moments were filled with chaos and confusion as the German forces scrambled to respond. Their guns, designed to take down soldiers, were useless against the tanks' thick armor. The tanks' presence alone sent shock waves through the battlefield as soldiers who had once feared nothing now found themselves face to face with an enemy they didn't understand, one that they couldn't defeat. It was as if the very rules of warfare had been rewritten in an instant. For the British, there was an exhilarating sense of triumph. The tanks were more than just a weapon. They were a symbol of hope, of the possibility that just maybe this brutal war could be won. As the first tanks tore through the enemy lines, the soldiers cheered, knowing that they had just witnessed the birth of a new era in combat. But the tanks' success was not without its struggles. Despite their early victories, the machines quickly proved that they were not invincible. The battlefield was harsh, unforgiving, and the tanks were not immune to the challenges of war. The muddy terrain, which had already proven to be a nightmare for soldiers, was equally difficult for the tanks to navigate. Their massive tracks, designed to carry them over obstacles, often became bogged down in the muck. Several tanks, unable to move forward, became sitting ducks, easy targets for enemy artillery. Some of the tanks' engines overheated, forcing them to grind to a halt, their crews trapped inside. Others broke down completely, their tracks snapping under the pressure of the uneven terrain. The tanks, which had seemed unstoppable in the early moments of their deployment, now revealed their limitations. For the soldiers who had placed their hopes in these machines, the sight of the tanks becoming disabled was a bitter reminder of the harsh reality of war. Yet, despite these setbacks, the tanks continued to press on, each one embodying the resilience of the men who had designed and built them. They may have been imperfect, but they were still a force to be reckoned with. As the battle raged on, the tanks' presence on the battlefield continued to shake the enemy, even as the tanks themselves struggled to perform at their full potential. It was clear that these machines were still a work in progress, but they were already proving their worth. For every tank that broke down, another kept moving forward, pushing through the chaos, embodying the same determination that had been instilled in their creators. The tanks were not the perfect weapon they had hoped for, but they were a step towards something greater, a symbol of innovation, resilience, and the future of warfare. The shift in attitude towards the tank came slowly, like the creeping realization of dawn. At first, the military establishment had viewed the Mark I as nothing more than a curiosity, a strange, untested weapon that could never match the battlefield realities of entrenched warfare. Many commanders had laughed at the idea, dismissing it as impractical and far too experimental to succeed. But as the tanks began to demonstrate their effectiveness on the battlefield, that mockery turned into a wary respect. The first tanks that had been deployed to the Somme had proved their worth in small but undeniable ways. They had broken through the enemy's lines, obliterating obstacles that had been thought insurmountable. Yet, even as these early successes were celebrated, the military remained cautious. The tanks were slow, cumbersome, and prone to mechanical failures. Still, there was something about them that could not be ignored. They had the potential to change everything. Slowly but surely, military leaders began to see the value in what had once seemed like a fantastical idea. The shift from skepticism to respect was palpable. The soldiers who had once doubted the tanks now saw them as vital to the success of the war, and as the generals and officers began to recognize their utility, they began to rethink strategy. The tanks were no longer just a novelty, they were the future of warfare. The transition from mockery to acceptance was not instantaneous, but when it came, it was a turning point, one that would fundamentally alter the course of the war. As the tanks proved themselves on the battlefield, their role in the larger war effort began to take shape. No longer relegated to small, experimental engagements, the tanks were now being used in full-scale assaults. Military leaders began to see that the tanks could provide a way to break through enemy lines in ways that infantry and artillery could not. In subsequent battles, tanks were deployed in greater numbers, supporting infantry and pushing the front lines forward. Their impact was undeniable. The tank's ability to cross difficult terrain, destroy barbed wire, and clear enemy defenses allowed them to reshape the dynamics of combat. For the soldiers on the ground, the tanks were a new kind of support, unlike anything they had ever seen before. Where the trenches had once been a place of despair, now there was the possibility of breakthrough, of pushing forward to victory. The sight of a tank charging toward the enemy lines inspired a new kind of hope. The tank was no longer just a weapon, it was a symbol of the future. Its presence on the battlefield was the herald of a new way of fighting, a way that could potentially end the grinding stalemate of trench warfare. The tanks were not perfect. They still had their flaws, but their role in the larger war effort was undeniable. They were a tool of change, and with each battle, they gained in importance, becoming an integral part of military strategy. The impact of the tank reached far beyond its immediate use in battle. The presence of these mechanized monsters on the battlefield marked the beginning of the end for the trench warfare that had defined World War I. For years, soldiers had been locked in a brutal, stagnant war, fighting over tiny stretches of land in a way that seemed pointless and unending. The trench systems, with their narrow, muddy passageways and constant shelling, had become a symbol of the hopelessness of the conflict. But the introduction of the tank disrupted that system. For the first time, there was a way to break through the stalemate, to move beyond the trenches and force the enemy to face something they could not control. The tanks didn't just attack the enemy, they attacked the very structure of trench warfare itself. Their ability to move across the battlefield, bypassing the obstacles that had once made trench warfare so effective, forced a reevaluation of military strategy. As tanks pushed deeper into enemy territory, they rendered the traditional trench system obsolete. The end of trench warfare was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The tank had provided the key to breaking the deadlock, and as the war continued, its role in battle became ever more pronounced. The sense of finality that came with the tank's success in battle was palpable. The long, drawn-out struggle of trench warfare was coming to an end, and with that, a new chapter in military history had begun, a chapter defined by mobility, mechanization, and the power of innovation. The peace that would eventually come after the war would be the result of countless innovations, but none so important as the tank. It had brought an end to a war that had seemed endless, and in doing so, it had redefined the future of warfare. The legacy of the Mark I tank stretches far beyond the trenches of World War I, reaching into the heart of every modern battlefield. In the years following the war, the tank, once a crude experimental weapon, was refined and adapted, becoming a staple of military forces around the world. The post-war period saw the tank evolve from a powerful but unwieldy force into a more agile and versatile machine designed for speed, precision, and maximum firepower. In the interwar years, nations began to build on the lessons learned from the Mark I, creating lighter, faster tanks that could be deployed in rapid assaults. The principles that underpinned the design of the Mark I, the need for mobility, protection, and offensive capability, were refined and adapted to meet the demands of new warfare. By the time World War II arrived, tanks had become central to military strategy. The Mark I's rough prototypes were long gone, replaced by a new generation of armored vehicles that could dominate the battlefield with unprecedented power. Yet, even as these newer tanks advanced in design, the Mark I remained an enduring symbol of innovation. The simple yet revolutionary concept of an armored mobile fortress had set the stage for an entire class of vehicles that would shape warfare for decades to come. The Mark I was no longer just a weapon, it had become a foundation upon which the future of combat would be built. The tanks of the post-war era carried with them the memory of that first rumbling beast, a reminder of how far humanity had come in its pursuit of progress. The evolution of the tank after the Mark I was nothing short of extraordinary. From the first clumsy machines, slowly advancing across muddy battlefields, to the sleek, powerful tanks of World War II and beyond, the Mark I had provided the blueprint for a new era of warfare. As military technology advanced, so too did the capabilities of armored vehicles. The basic principles behind the Mark I, its armor, its mobility, its ability to break through entrenched lines, were carried forward into future designs, but with each new model, these features were refined and enhanced. Tanks became faster, more maneuverable, and more powerful, incorporating advanced technology such as more powerful engines, better armor, and improved weapon systems. The creation of tank divisions, where hundreds of these machines could be deployed in a single offensive, became a cornerstone of modern military strategy. The tank had gone from being a novelty, something to be mocked and doubted, to being an essential component of military doctrine. The evolution of armored warfare, from the slow-moving Mark I to the fast, lethal tanks of today, was a testament to the ingenuity and persistence of the engineers, commanders, and soldiers who believed in the potential of the tank. Each new iteration built upon the lessons learned from the Mark I, creating a legacy of growth and development that would continue to shape military strategies for generations. The Mark I may have been a rough prototype, but it was the spark that ignited a revolution in armored warfare. As the tank evolved, so too did humanity's understanding of the consequences of technological progress. The introduction of the Mark I was not just a military innovation, it was a philosophical turning point. The tank, in its most basic form, embodied the dual-edged nature of human ingenuity. On one hand, it was a triumph of innovation, a perfect example of what could be achieved when humanity pushed the boundaries of possibility. It represented hope, the possibility of victory in a war that had seemed interminable. But on the other hand, it also highlighted the darker side of technological progress. The Mark I was designed to kill, to break through the defenses of the enemy, and deliver destruction. As tanks became more advanced, they became instruments of war, used in battles that destroyed cities and claimed countless lives. The ethical implications of such innovations were not lost on those who witnessed the rise of the tank. The Mark I forced humanity to confront the moral complexities of progress, how technological advancements, while capable of achieving great feats, also carried with them the potential for unimaginable destruction. The legacy of the tank is not just one of military success, but also one of reflection on the cost of progress. It forces us to ask difficult questions about the role of innovation in shaping our world and the responsibilities that come with it. The Mark I tank, in all its raw power, stands as a reminder of both the heights we can reach through invention and the weight of the decisions we make in pursuit of progress. As we look back on the history of the tank, we are reminded not just of the triumphs, but of the moral and philosophical legacy it leaves behind, a legacy that continues to influence our relationship with technology and warfare to this day.